Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming-events.htm.
Good evening again. Welcome to the Louisville Free Public Library. For those of you who have not been here before, I think we have a few. Who's not been here to this particular class before? This is your first time to this. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much. Too much to catch you up on there. But at the end of this, we will have, this is what I wanted to say. At the end of this entire course, I will post the slides from this course so you can go back and look and see perhaps what you have missed. If you're new to this space, just so you know, the restrooms are out the door to your left and then again to your left. They are single occupancy, they lock, and there's a little slider that says vacant and, what's the opposite of vacant? Occupied, right, I don't know. It's been a long day. So you can slide that if you will, but please slide it back to vacant when you're done so no one just sits there thinking it's occupied. Last week, if you weren't here, just so you know, we did a core sample of a tree out here, and hopefully next week, yes, possibly, maybe?
Yes.
Next week we'll have that all sanded and polished, and we can look at the life of that tree right out there, which is wonderful. I think that's everything. If you want to know what's coming up at the library, any of the branches to the end of this month, over there are calendars. And also, if I didn't mention before, I have some books on display. All of them pertain to the subject of trees, but I added a couple that specifically pertain to tree rings. And if you've not looked, they're over there now. You can check those out at the end of the evening, if you'd like. Otherwise, thank you very much, and welcome, Dr. Rochner.
Thanks again. All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome back, and welcome to the new faces in the room. When I saw a few hands pop up for people who haven't been there yet, I thought, I'm going to go back a few slides and sort of refresh everyone's memories yet again, partly because today I want to dig a little deeper into a little bit more technical stuff. So I want to make sure that the new people in the room also have a bit of the foundation or understand where we're coming from to begin with. So on the first day of this class, I talked a lot about what is dendrochronology or tree ring science. Last week, we spent most of our time outside coring a tree and seeing the process of collecting a sample to do tree ring analysis. So this is sort of a nice place to sort of recap and get everyone back on the same page again. So I am Dr. Maegen Rochner at University of Louisville, and I am a tree ring scientist or a dendrochronologist. Dendro for tree and chrono for time. I specifically study the rings of a tree as a proxy, we call it. A proxy is something that can stand in for written records. Tree rings are natural recorders of events and change in the environment, in the world, through time. So they're a proxy. I mean, imagine we can go back 100 years or so with our climate station data. We can go back a little bit further with written records like ship logs. And for example, in Japan, they've been recording when the cherry blossoms bloom for hundreds to thousands of years. We can use those types of human archives to understand the past. If we want to go beyond that, we rely on natural archives. These are things like tree rings, lake sediment cores, ice cores. Maybe you've heard of they drill in Greenland and in the Arctic to look at past change. Tree rings can go back thousands of years. Lake sediment cores, tens of thousands of years, maybe more. The cores of the ocean bottom, the ice cores go back tens to hundreds of thousands of years. So these are things that help us understand the past back to when we weren't really writing things down, and also sort of like pre-human history on this planet. So tree rings are one of those proxies. So what I do is I look at the rings of a tree and how they change through time, and also evidence of specific events or trauma, things like scars or changes in growth that might indicate an extreme event. You've probably, again, looked at a cross-section of a stump. Maybe you learned how to count the rings of a tree to see how old it is. I collect a core, and this is what we did last week. Those who were here, we collect what's called an increment core from the tree, and we're basically coring across what we call the cross-sectional view. If you've looked at a stump that's been cut off straight, we're coring through that view looking at the same rings. But this allows us to collect a core without killing the tree. We don't have to cut trees down to look at their records. We extract something that looks a little bit like this, and I've put an idealized version, again, of this up here, and it's a version that's a conifer, a pine tree, a spruce tree, something like that. We have both light bands and dark bands. The light band in a conifer is called the early wood or the early season wood. This is the spring into the early summer. And then the dark band, the wood becomes dense, the cell walls get thicker as the tree goes into late summer and towards dormancy for the winter. So combined, it's the light and the dark that equal 1 year. So when we're looking at this example, it's the two together. So we look at relationships between the growth of a tree and things like climate, precipitation, temperature. We look for changes in growth. In this example, the tree's growing pretty happy here, and then the rings get much narrower for a period of 5 or 6 years. This could be caused to some damage to the tree, an infestation, something that's caused the tree to devote more energy, say, to healing a wound or to regenerating branches than to putting on girth. Sometimes we look for more extreme events, so it might not be a change of growth that is sustained for a long period of time, but it's a significant deviation in the average growth for 1 year, a really narrow or a really wide ring. This could be something like a drought, so a year that is unique in some way from what happens on average. We can look for specific trauma to the tree. And I apologize, my clicker is a little bit slow. A scar could be indicative of something like a fire or another tree falling on it, or a lightning strike, or a landslide, or something that damages the tree but doesn't kill it. And then the tree tries to grow over that wound over time. This creates a very distinctive sort of curl. So in this example, the event happened at the end of this year right here. And then since then, the tree every year grows a little bit over that wound, trying to basically seal it all the way back up. Now, it has emitted resin and things to sort of cover the wound and seal it and protect it from damage, but it takes the tree sometimes a very long time to physically grow back over it. And sometimes with fire, if the tree doesn't grow all the way back over and another fire moves through, it'll just scar again. And it will never actually get to seal up that wound. And I'll show you some pictures of examples of that. They're called cat face scars that are evidence of fire and frequent fire in an ecosystem. And then some other anomalies in the growth. An example is a frost ring. A frost ring occurs when you have significant cooling during the growing season that causes cellular damage. So the tree is actually putting on cells, it's growing, it's transporting water, it's doing its business during the growing season, and for some reason, it gets incredibly cold during the growing season. So think like a freezing event during the growing season, like crop failure. All of our crops would be significantly impacted by a freeze event during the growing season. The same thing, similar happens to trees. They leave a record of that behind. And this example specifically is of a frost ring caused by a cooling event in the end of a growing season in Wyoming, Montana, that was caused by a volcanic eruption. So volcanic eruptions emit a lot of material into the atmosphere, sometimes into the upper levels of the atmosphere where they'll stick around for long periods of time, blocking solar radiation from reaching the Earth, which can cause a cooling event, which can cause a frost ring. And in this case, this was an eruption in Peru. I've talked about it a couple times by now, but I still think that's really cool that we are able to track volcanic eruptions in Peru using triggering evidence in the Greater Yellowstone. And then we can also use tree rings to investigate humans on the landscape. Human land use change. Typically, things like if there's been mass clearing for agriculture or for timber production, sometimes trees get left behind for aesthetic reasons, or maybe they're a little bit gnarly and not good for the logging company, so they leave them behind. And then what is sometimes the case is those regions are allowed to reforest later. We have a lot of examples of that here in Kentucky and here around Louisville, where we have a history of land clearing, but then some areas have been reforested over time, sometimes just due to farm or land abandonment, but sometimes because we have areas that are now parks, like Bernheim, or the Parklands, or Taylorsville Lake State Park. All those areas were pretty clear-cut at some point and now are forested again. But when you go out like me, you're looking for the old ones, and sometimes you can find them still left behind, even in those areas that we believe were completely clear-cut at some point. Sometimes trees were left behind. So just for the folks who haven't been here yet, the main way we collect data is the increment core. This is what we did last week over here. We take those, we put them in wooden core mounts, and this is the mount that you can see. And then we can hold that upside down to a bench sander. Because the cores are really tiny. If you come next week, I'll bring that core back, and I'll bring some examples of archaeological cores specifically, because I want to talk more about that. They're pretty tiny, so you don't want to just hold your core up against a big sander like that. So we put it in a mount. We sand them till we can see the tree rings pretty much to a fine polish, even the cells of the tree rings themselves. The other way I tend to get data, which might surprise you, is from archaeological timbers, from timbers that are in buildings or log cabins or canoes. You can even, without actually taking a sample, analyze rings in wooden paintings, in musical instruments, in a lot of things. I mean, even little statues carved out of wood, there are ways that we can investigate the tree rings in them. Because in some places, like Kentucky, we don't have a lot of old growth forests left. The old tree rings have all been harvested, and you can still find them sometimes hidden in historic buildings and artifacts. This is an example of collecting a core from a joist under a house in Charlotte, North Carolina. This is a little bit more of the extreme conditions. Now, the plastic was nice because it was cleaner than a lot of crawl spaces are, and I was glad for that. Often, we're not having to do quite this extreme, but we try to find those old timbers, those old tree rings, sometimes hidden in buildings. This is an example of what the cores look like coming from a building. This is from the cabin in Central Park in Ashland, Kentucky, if anyone's ever been there. It's another Olmsted Park, really old park that potentially has at least as old as the founding of the park, late 1800s, trees in it. And they've also relocated a log cabin to this site that I think might be one of the oldest in the state. I haven't dated it yet because we were just there not too long ago. But it was spectacular coring. So this is an example of what we like to happen, which is we collect the cores. We do this with a power drill, as you saw in the previous video, which drills out around it. And what we want to happen is they stay intact in the log after we've done the drilling, and we just have to pop them out. So these are whole logs. There's just like collecting cores from a standing tree, except this tree was cut down 150 plus years ago and started growing in the 1600s. I can still extract that tree ring data. And sometimes we collect tree rings with chainsaws. This is if a tree is already dead or down on the ground, or sometimes what we call remnant wood. Remnant wood is dead wood on the landscape. Here in Kentucky, we don't work with remnant wood a lot because what happens to wood that lays on the ground in Kentucky for very long? Yeah, it rots away. It doesn't persist for very long, so it's hard to find old remnant wood in these types of climates. But if you go out west, where it's much, much drier, you can find wood on the landscape that's been there for hundreds of years. I actually found a remnant that still had bark on it, but the outer ring was in the 1600s. So it died hundreds of years ago, and that bark is still there, just laying out in the meadow east of Yellowstone. It's a really, really old wood. And this is what I was able to use in my dissertation, reconstruct summertime temperatures for the Yellowstone region for 1,200 years into the past. So I was able to build a chronology, we call it, a tree ring data set that goes back to the 700s and understand, how what's happening in Yellowstone now relates to the last 1,000+ years in time. So we have a lot of different methods of getting these samples. We have our small cores like we got last week. We have our little bit thicker archaeological cores, and sometimes just full cross sections. If we're collecting from dead wood or from, say, a log from a cabin that's already been removed from the structure, if we can, I'll just go in there with a chainsaw if I have the ability to do so. If they're not intending to reuse it in any specific way, I will just collect full sections from those. And this is preferred because we can see all the way around the tree for many of the years. We take these cores and we look at, again, that relationship. Think back to that diagram I showed you of the fake tree core and how it relates to change. So we look for changes in growth. This is an example of how red spruce responded to a landslide event in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So this sudden reduction in growth. These are called traumatic resin ducts. They indicate where the tree is pumping a lot of resin, sticky, really, really sticky sap to a wound or an injury. So it indicates in that year something has happened that has caused the tree to do that. And this, again, is a fire scar on a spruce sample from the greater Yellowstone. These are TRDs from Mount Rainier, and this is that polish that we really want because you can actually go in and see every little cell of that tree ring. And you can also nowadays look at the cellular structure itself as an even better proxy for climate change. So we've now developed in our technology to where you can measure every single one of these cells and how big they are, how thick their walls are, and see how that relates to climate and environmental change. So this was the recap. For those who are new, trees help us understand the past. They help us understand things like how a tree responds to change. So we can understand how that tree might respond to similar changes in the future. How does a tree respond to drought? Under climate change in some regions of the world, more extreme drought is expected. So understanding how different species will respond to drought is important. Understanding how this varies. So some species may be more or less resilient to change. That informs the future. It might also direct decision-making. In the city, we're trying to combat the urban heat island effect here in the city of Louisville. We do that by planting trees, but we might have to be strategic about which trees we plant. They need to be trees that are resilient to the conditions that exist now and the conditions that are going to exist because of the combination of climate change and the urban heat island. They help us understand climate and environmental extremes, how often these extremes occur. So you can understand how intense and severe a fire of the past was and how often those occur. and then compare that to things that are happening now. So when we put modern events into historic context, we can see, are these events unprecedented? Are they not? Are they occurring more frequently than they have in the past? Or are they occurring at the same frequency? So it helps us understand what's happening now. And that's really important part of what I do, providing long-term context for modern events. So trees do help us understand the past, but in understanding that, we can better understand / inform the future. They help us predict what's going to happen next. So today, like I said, I did want to dig a little deeper into some of the more technical stuff. So I want to talk about applications of tree rearing science today, and I've sort of foreshadowed and alluded to those a lot already, but I wanted to show some more specific examples of these. And feel free, if you have questions about anything that I'm talking about, to just raise your hand as I'm going. You don't have to wait. But we'll try to keep it to things that are related to what I'm talking about so we can keep moving forward. Yes?
You said that trees sometimes will try and grow to cover a star. Do they ever grow back together in a way, like, you know, you can wrap a branch on it and it feels like it's the same part of the tree? Do they ever grow back into each other again, or is there always going to be like a bark in between? Does that make sense? Like if it's coming around.
Yes. So the question's about, as a tree is growing and curling over a scar, does it ever come back together? So there will always be evidence of the scar left, and you see it in the curls. But eventually the curls can meet back up. And you see the sort of continued of adjoining curls until it does sort of seal up, and then the rings become a little bit more normal again. And that scar becomes buried inside. So you can miss a scar. You know, the question is like, what can you miss a scar? Yes, you can. Sometimes you can still see a change in the growth because of that same event, even if you, say, got above or below the scar. The type of scar depends on the event. You know, a tree falling could scar a tree up high. It could scar a tree down low, just wherever it hits. Fires typically scar from the ground up. A rock hitting a tree could happen anywhere. Lightning strikes are typically long ones that can go all the way down the tree. So it just varies. We look for those because if we're after that data about the event, we will look for the scar and core it or sample it directly. So we try not to miss it. Sometimes, though, they're buried, and you would only find them by accidentally coring them, or you try to collect data from the remnant wood, again, all the dead wood on the landscape, because in that case, you can chainsaw it as much as you want, and you can hopefully catch those scars that you miss in your cores. Experience is how you sort of learn how to pick out the old trees from the not. Sometimes you get surprised. I always tend to say you don't know how old a tree is unless you can core it. It's the only definitive way that you can determine the age of a tree. Because you can estimate as much as you'd like, but you could be very incorrect. Around here, and we've talked about this before, what do you think of when you think of an old tree? Yeah, it's big. We think big is old. It's not always the case. It's not actually usually the case. Big usually means happy. Big usually means that tree got everything it needed and it's still getting everything it needs to get big and fat, okay? Especially big and straight with a big open happy crown. Those are not old trees. They could be gigantic. I have a red oak in my neighbor's yard behind me, I'm sure. It's less than 100 years old, but it's huge. It's usually the trees that have had a hard way about it. The ones that look like they've been through it. They have barely any crown, or the crown's like crooked and going over this way, or the tree's like twisting as it goes up and like winding around. It's even got a dead top, so carrot top trees. The crown's still sparse and there's a dead leader. So you learn like how to identify those sorts of things that help you guess whether it's an old tree. Big branches, really big branches high up, because a lot of people think that branches move up with the tree. They do not. Branches stay where they are, and the tree grows around it. So branches don't move up the tree. So if it's got branches way, way up high and they're gigantic, it had to first get that big and then have that many years to produce a branch that size. Big branches lower down, not as impressive. Because if big branch lower down means it just as many years it took it to get this big, and then all the years since. So those are the things we learn to look for. Now, you do occasionally get surprised. Often I tend to be, I'll toot my own horn a bit. I tend to be pretty good about finding old ones. It's the ones you think are young that occasionally surprise you. And it's usually because of very extreme, say, growing conditions. The old tree I found in Bernheim had like 100 years and a few inches, and then it just opened up. So it was happy for most of its life, but something was happening when that tree was young that caused it to grow really, really slow. And that was just kind of hiding deep inside. So sometimes you have to core it to know for sure. Yeah. I hadn't planned to talk about that specifically. So the question is like, how do you know how old remnant wood, dead wood is? That sometimes takes just practice. An example that I have is for my dissertation. Had 4 years, actually had 5 years in the field because I got a head start for my dissertation. And each year we sort of just got after sort of going out, collecting remnant wood, dating it in the lab, we thought, okay, we know more and more about what to look for to find the oldest pieces. Where we were in Wyoming, Montana, was 10,000 feet elevation. And what was cool about it is you're out in the middle of an alpine meadow, legit just the hills are alive with the sound of music. You want to just spin and tip, like whatever you want to enjoy. It's beautiful. You're up with the wildflowers in the alpine meadow. There's still snow on the ground in July. It's beautiful. And there are a bunch of young trees on the landscape, but nothing really old. And then out in the middle of the meadow is this tree about this big laying over. So you're like, wow, that tree is a lot different from anything else that's here. It's currently mostly meadow, so there used to be really big trees here. So then you look for, if it still has branches on it, it hasn't been dead as long. So if it still has bark, branches, it hasn't been dead as long. The branches and bark start to come off over time. It's a little bit older. The outer part gets to get a little sculpted by the elements. It's even older. And we actually got to where we were looking just for pieces of wood on the landscape. Tiny little pieces stuck in a rock somewhere that turned out to be like wood from 1,000 years ago. And when you're working with really old trees, sometimes that piece of wood could have 400 rings on it. So it was what we needed. So that's part of it, like just the decay, the level of breakdown of the wood tells you how old it is. So we looked for that old stuff. Usually by that point in Kentucky, you're not finding it anymore. But there's some really old stuff, say, like Native American artifacts and stuff in the caves in Kentucky. If they're in a little bit drier environment or a more consistent environment, it might persist for a little bit longer. But still nothing like out in really dry areas. So I did want to spend some time talking about the principles of dendrochronology. Because I feel like in any class about this, I have to at least bring this up. And bear with me, I think this is the most technical part. But what I want people to understand is that it's not just about counting the rings. Now, if you go out and you count the rings on your stump in your backyard, you're going to do a pretty good job estimating the age of a tree. And for you, if you're off by 1 or 2 years, not a big deal, really. So like, oh, it's 50 years old, give or take 2. That doesn't really change what I think about this tree. But if you do what I do, we can't be off. One of the great things about tree ring science is it's one of the few proxies that help us date things to a year, the year it happened, sometimes to the season of the year that it happened. It's one of few things that actually let us do that. There's no plus or minus in tree ring science. It's like this fire happened in the year 548 in the fall. It's great. But there are some steps then that we have to take along the way to make sure that we're dating things correctly. And there are a few sort of principles you have to understand when you're using tree rings. So I want to go through these. And they're not actually as intimidating, I think, as I'm making them sound. So we're going to go through each of these. These are the important principles of tree ring science. This is actually, I'm a little shaded, but this is me quarrying a tree on the shore of Isle Royale in Lake Superior, Michigan. Another great thing about being a tree ring scientist is all the cool places you get to go. So the first principle is called Uniformitarianism. Has anyone heard of it? If I had a geologist in the room, maybe they have. The simple version of this is the present is the key to the past. You can observe a process happening today and assume that's the same way that process has happened for all time. Important in geology, you can go watch a volcano erupt and understand how a volcano might have erupted 1 million years ago. It's an assumption, though, that you make, that observing how something happens now informs how it happened in the past. It's important to tree ring scientists because we observe how trees are responding to something now in the last 100, maybe even the last 1,000 years. But then we use that to understand and reconstruct conditions even further back. So we have to make the assumption that how a tree responds to something now is the way it always has. So the way a tree responds to a drought today is the way a tree has always responded to a drought. We have to make that very important assumption. So it's a big deal in geology, but it also applies when we're using these environmental proxies. This is an example of a really simple climate reconstruction done using tree rings that goes back to 200 BC. This was done with tree rings in New Mexico. So they found actual trees that went back to BC. Up here we have warmer temperatures. Down here we have cooler temperatures. The tree rings actually only overlap with the climate data that we have for the last 100 years or so. So we only know for sure that relationship over the last 100 years between tree rings and climate. We use that overlap in time to understand the relationships and understand the response of the trees to climate change. But we don't have that instrumental data to confirm it even further back. We assume that how trees have responded in that last 100 years is the way they always have. And we use that relationship then to reconstruct climate. I'll talk a little bit more about this, just a little bit. But this is a big part of what tree ring scientists do. We use the relationships that happen now to reconstruct the past. So that's the first one. Yeah. Yes, so you're getting to a really important point that one of the values of reconstructing past climate is relating it to human history. Understanding the collapse of civilizations. What caused that? Tree rings have helped us understand the collapse of the Mayan civilization and others. Typically drought. Typically drought. Yeah. If the trees aren't doing well, then humans might not be either, right? Yeah, if the trees are, especially under drought conditions, humans can't grow food in the place that they live. They can't support their population anymore. It goes downhill from there. So that's the first principle. The second one is what's called the principle of limiting factors. Tree growth can only proceed as fast as allowed by the primary environmental and physiological mechanisms that restrict growth. A tree can only grow as fast as environmental conditions allow. If you live in the desert, what is the thing that you really need but doesn't really exist in very large quantities? Water, exactly. So a tree in the desert, the limiting factor of growth in the desert is water. It can only grow as fast as allowed by the existence of water in the desert. If you live at the top of a mountain, what is the thing that you would prefer to have that is hard to come by? And not oxygen. Warmth, yeah. The sun, warmth, yeah. So at high elevations, the limiting factor is temperature. Where I worked at in Wyoming and Montana, the growing season was like 1 month. That's it. They had very little time to grow. So that was the limiting factor. Temperatures being warm enough for the tree to grow. And it was pretty short. So we look for, as tree ring scientists, we look for trees that are growing in an environment where factors like that are limiting. In Kentucky, a little bit harder to come by. It's usually decently warm, long growing season, and it's usually decently wet, lots of precipitation. So trees are getting a lot of what they need. So they're not as stressed as, say, a tree in the desert or a tree at the top of a mountain. We do see that trees in Kentucky respond pretty well to drought when a drought year occurs. It does stand out in the tree ring record. But for the most part, the trees are what we call complacent. They grow consistently and evenly every year. That's not what tree ring scientists want. We want the stressed out trees because we need a pattern in growth. We need growth to change year to year for us to understand anything. If growth is the same every year, there's no indication of anything that's happening in the environment. So those trees aren't as useful for us. Yeah, it means the trees are happy. Good for the tree, not for the tree ring scientists in that case. This relates to the next one, which I've combined. Ecological amplitude, and this affects site selection. Site selection just means where we tend to go looking for trees. I've already told you we want trees that are growing in limiting conditions. We want the trees that are stressed out. So where that typically is at the edge of the range of a species. So the range of a species is where it will grow spatially, because the conditions are right for that species to exist. As you get closer and closer to the edge of the range, you're sort of working at the fringes of where that species is happy. In the middle of the range, that tree is probably pretty consistently getting what it needs. But as you get closer to the edges, you're getting closer to where there's more likelihood the tree will be stressed out. Yes? So sometimes it's the old, gnarly, unhappy ones, like I've talked about before. But often this has to do with the site that you choose. So before you're even looking for trees, you're looking for sites that are going to have the best trees on them for doing what we do. So, in Kentucky, I would still look for, I'll skip to the next slide, I would still look for steep slopes over bottomlands. Because here, in this example on the right, this tree's growing down on flatlands or down at the bottom of a valley. It's really close to the water table. So it's in an area where the soil retains moisture over time. It may even be tapped into the water table. So when it rains, for that tree, it doesn't make that big of a difference. That tree's like, it's raining, but I've got my roots in the water table. No big deal. But if this tree that's growing on a steep slope, especially if it's growing in an area where it's more rocky, or there's not much soil development, it means there's not much there to hold on to water. That tree's way up above, away from the water table, not tapped into a creek or anything. The only water it gets is when it rains, and the water flows through the soil on its way to the water table. So this tree, when it rains, is like, yes, it's raining. And it responds. This tree does not. This is the complacent tree. We look for this tree. So even here, we would pick our site. Maybe we go out to Daniel Boone National Forest. But I'm not always going to core the trees down by the water. I'm going to go up the hill, up to the ridge top. And it varies. When I'm looking for old oaks, I look for oaks that are high and dry. But occasionally, you still find old trees that are these sorts of tapped into the water table. The old hemlocks, for example, there are old hemlocks out there. They like to grow where there's water, but they still could have been there for a while. Usually this tree is sensitive to water. This tree, which could still be old, it might not be sensitive to water because it's tapped right into it, but maybe it's sensitive to temperature then. Because water is not the limiting factor. Temperature is. So these are the things we look for. This is an example of what are called ecotones. There are some regions of the world where you can travel all the way from tropical rainforest to tundra by just going up in elevation. The same transition happens as we go up in latitude, from the equator to the Arctic. But in some places it happens more quickly because of elevation. So along ecotones, you will see these edges of the ranges of different species happening. So instead of going maybe lower in the middle, if we want sensitive trees, we're going to go up here right at tree line, right where they're on the edge of the conditions that they prefer. These trees are going to be more responsive to change because the conditions are more limiting, temperature in that case, and they're a little bit stressed out. So those are the trees that we look for. The main reason for all of that is that to truly date a tree, we have to cross-date that tree. I showed this one quickly on day one because y'all had so many questions. We jumped ahead to this. And this is a lot. But we want trees that have variability. So we want things like this. There's some really narrow years, there's some wide years, there's some medium years, and from year to year it changes. They're not complacent. This creates a very distinct pattern. And that pattern is responding to the environment, mainly climate, but also other things. So it's like a fingerprint. A tree is like a fingerprint of the environment around it and how it's changed through time. To truly date, we take 2 cores per tree, sometimes more. We core 20 to 30 trees per site, and we might do multiple sites for an area. That dissertation site I keep showing you, I cored like 500 trees. and took sections from a ton of remnants. I have like a couple hundred remnants. I had a lot of data to process. That might be a little extreme. Like I sampled that site to death. You don't always have to do that, but you do want to get enough samples that you account for the local variability, the change that can happen from tree to tree. We date trees by cross-dating them, pattern matching them to each other. Do you have a question? Yeah, I'm gonna get your arm's gonna get tired. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So usually you're cross-dating within the same species because species respond to climate in different ways. Some are more responsive to drought than others. Some are more sensitive to drought than others. And it can vary. So sometimes you want to at least start with the same species. Then you might see how well other species in an area match with each other. Because all of the trees are growing in the same area, they should be responding to the same climate environment. They may not respond exactly the same, and they never do. You know, nature does not perfectly duplicate, even across a small space. But that pattern's going to show up. The narrow rings should all line up. The wide rings should all line up. Every tree is experiencing the same thing. So this is the principle of cross-dating. A tree, first, the two cores in a tree should match each other in their pattern. Then the trees in a same site should match each other. If they don't, that tells you there might be something wrong. In this example, we have A and B. Okay. A is if you just counted the rings. Going from left to right, we see there's sort of a narrow one here, a narrow one there, a really wide one there, a really wide one there. Everything's lining up so far. But then what happens right here? What do you notice about right here versus right here? People in the front might be able to see better. Yes, one has more rings than the other. One has 2 and one has 3. So if you were just counting, see how they've marked ring 10? Now they're off. You keep going, and what do you notice about right here versus right here? Yeah, something happened. There's a really narrow ring here, right here, that doesn't exist. It's missing from the top. And now if you were just counting, now you're off by 2. And it can keep going. These are what are called locally absent rings. They could be just locally absent, say, in one tree and exist in all the others. They could be just locally absent on one side of the tree, but exist on the other side. The reason for this is that trees grow from the top down. It's in the crown that trees produce a growth hormone, auxin, and it moves down the tree like melting wax, unevenly down the tree. In a really good year, there's plenty of growth hormone produced. It comes all the way down the tree, all the way around, and down into the roots. A ring is put on all the way around in that year. In a more stressful year, it will produce less growth hormone that might come down, and it comes down like wax. So it might come down and make it to this side where you cored, but not make it to this side where your B core was. Or maybe if it's really bad, it doesn't make it down there at all where you cored. So it's missing. So imagine my job is to find things that don't exist. You're like, how do you find something that isn't there? And you do it through pattern matching because the odds are it's there in at least one of your trees, you hope. And if you can find it in the one, you can see where it offsets the pattern in all of your others, and you can identify that. So down here, If you account for those missing rings, and the 2 diagonal dots is how we mark on a core that there's a missing ring, the patterns match all the way across. But if you were just counting, you would be off. If this was your core, if say that top core is the one we took, now I very much doubt there's the missing rings in the oak that we cored out in the lawn, because it's getting, it's on a lawn that might be occasionally fertilized or at least watered or manicured and taken care of, right? It had to be really extreme conditions. There are missing rings in Kentucky. It is a thing here, particularly in certain species. And there are some species that are more likely to have them than others. So the reason I tell you all this is I get into the more technical part just because it's not just the counting. So when you're approaching it truly from my perspective as a tree ring scientist, you can't just count. You have to do this first. And this relies on all of those principles. There has to be limiting factors. There has to be variability in the growth.
At this point, is it you blind this under the microscope? It's not some device you mark it.
Yes, it's still us doing everything manually. No one has, like AI'd their way through that yet. And I'm happy about that. There's certain parts of my job I would like to expedite, and the other parts where you really can't replace a human looking at the wood itself and understanding it. And understanding the site. Like a machine's never going to understand where that wood came from. And understanding where it came from informs what you understand is real, not real, feasible, not feasible. You have to understand those things.
Is it real important that humans go behind humans so that you're not doing this in isolation? So it's part of the validation process. I understand you're probably in a specialty where you don't have a lot of people looking at this, but you want 2 people or 5 or 10 people to almost, without even looking at what you've done, come to the same conclusion you did because you look at it in isolation. Maybe
Yes.
Maybe not even being a person in Louisville and a person in like North Carolina, but you could look at the same sample and say, well, we can see the same thing. It's real important in your profession.
Yes, yes and no. It kind of comes through in a different way. But we do, like within my lab, so the question's about basically independent verification. Do you have other people repeat the steps to make sure everyone comes to the same conclusion, which helps support that you're correct? In my lab, typically multiple students will look at things independently, and we'll talk about how their findings compare. That's one way to do it. The other way is there are a lot of checks and balances in dendro along the way. So we actually do this first stage visually. We just look at every core and every ring. We count them all. If I'm going through a tree in Kentucky, I'm like, okay, 1965 is narrow, 1955, I write it all down. Then I go through the next one, and I write down those rings again, and I see if they're lining up. And if they're not, I try to figure out why. And I actually try to just visually pattern match all my samples. Then we measure these ring widths to the nearest 0.001 thousandth of a millimeter. Very precise measurements. Either with a microscope and a moving stage that moves at that very, very incremental period, or with a scanned image. There's now software that you can measure from an image. Still not automated yet. You still have to look at your picture and tell it where the ring boundaries are. That generates our tree ring series, which we then statistically pattern match to each other. And there again, we find out, well, something's off. This one doesn't statistically match the others. And you go back to that core and you find out what's wrong. One of the reasons we do this, I realize I'm running out of time, we need accurately dated tree rings. We need that variability. We don't want the complacent one at the top. We want this one that has the variability. Sometimes that variability is not in the width, the full width itself. An example in pine especially, pine can sometimes have more variability in the late wood, the dark bands, than in the ring width in total. If you look at this, kind of all the rings, I mean, there's some narrow rings in there. They look a little bit more consistent, but if you look at the dark bands, you can see that they vary a little bit more. Some are really wide, some are incredibly narrow. There's one down here that's just, a few of these are really, really hiding in there. So sometimes we actually measure both to that same precision. We measure the width of the early wood, the width of the late wood, and the width of the whole thing. And pattern match all of them. Yeah. It's sometimes, it is usually precipitation driven. The late wood variability, like late season precipitation. You're in the hottest, warmest part of the year, and precipitation varies more. Potentially. You would test it to see if that is what your relationship is at that site and for that species. For example, I have colleagues who have been reconstructing tropical cyclone precipitation using the late wood widths, the dark bands. So they found a relationship between the width of the dark bands and whether or not a tropical cyclone came through that area in that year. Yeah, so they were able to look at how often, before we have written records for tropical cyclones potentially, they made landfall. Yes. Yes. So there are areas and there are species that don't put on annual rings. It makes what we do not impossible, but more complex. So, for example, I mean, you see annual rings where you have seasons, where there's actually a dormant season. So if you go further south to the tropics, they do not have a dormant season. Temperature is not the deciding factor. Instead, it's usually moisture. So there are wet and dry seasons. So you can actually see rings still, but a ring could be multiple years. You can still measure them. It'd be harder to find a relationship. Usually the way people study tropical tree rings is with other metrics like isotopes, so tree ring chemistry or anatomy, looking at the individual cells, look how they vary within a year, and look at those relationships to climate. So there are people who are using tropical tree rings. It's just a little bit more work. Yeah. So in the Keys, we're sort of at the edge of where trees are putting on annual rings. They still did. We were working with slash pine, and they had annual rings, but they were also a pain in the butt to pattern match, a lot more complicated. You're getting like down closer to that area. Yep. So you can measure carbon in tree rings, and there are relationships to mainly to photosynthesis and then what that connects to, and to precipitation. So I do not study isotopes myself, mainly because I don't have the capabilities in my lab to do so. I'm trying to break in. So my understanding is pretty rudimentary. But they look mainly at carbon and oxygen isotopes to look at temperature and precipitation. But you can also look at other elements in the environment, things like mercury. I have colleagues who have actually looked at nuclear testing in tree rings or trees near nuclear power plants when they've had some emissions into the surrounding environment. I think it could be a really cool application, and one reason I'm trying to get into tree ring chemistry in Louisville is I think we need to understand things like lead and mercury and other contaminants in our environment, and one way we might be able to do that is through trees. The trees could also help us highlight these historical environmental injustices that have been happening in our city. So that's why I'm trying to learn more about it. But trees are uptaking things from the environment, both through the roots and also through the stomata in the leaves and through the air, and it becomes part of their physical tissue. And you can break that down into its chemical elements.
The deciduous tree, I can understand how suddenly nutrition is going away and the growth changes. But why there's pigment in the dark, not shades of gray,
It's, yeah.
evergreens, they don't have that this week all the leaves fall dramatic event. So I'm struggling to understand why they're rings, why they appear so dark light.
So conifers still go dormant, even though they don't drop their needles. So they do still stop growing. And I mean, for example, some conifers might keep a needle for 3 or 5 years. So the needles just persist on the tree. It does mean there's differences in like the physiology and relationships to climate. For example, because a conifer keeps a needle on for longer, it might have relationships with climate from 3 years prior that still persist into the current year. So we also study the lagged relationship between climate and growth. I mean, because trees aren't just responding to what happens this year. Part of that is what happened the year before and the year before that. Now, conditions in the previous year allowed the tree to put on more leaves, more branches that benefited it in the following year. So there are these also lagged responses. The dark is not a pigmentation. The dark bands are because the cells have gotten smaller. So if my hands are a cell, my hands are the cell wall, and the area between is the lumen area. So in the spring, cell walls are thin, lumen area is big. It looks lighter. And as we go throughout the growing season, the cell walls get thicker and thicker and thicker, and the lumen area gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's denser, it looks darker. So you got those thicker cell walls. Yeah, that very definitive cutoff. I mean, we're thinking about it in a very human way of it being this like cutoff. I mean, but it is. Like the tree was like, okay, this cell, now I'm done. That's it. I mean, yeah, they're responding to changes in their environment that clue them in that it's time. And it essentially just stops. Yeah, it's really cool to think about. But yeah, and we know that varies from year to year. Like when we have a warmer, late sort of season, we see that in the city with the urban heat island and phenology. Growing season's just a teeny bit longer in the city, especially when it comes to spring. Anyone notice that things flower out maybe a little bit sooner in the city? Just a little bit. I've been trying to see if that affects growth or not. So, yeah.
Well, between, I live in Floyd Knobs, it's a little bit more elevated, but not terribly much. But I'm also more on the shady side of the woodland area. And it's definitely at least 2 or 3 weeks sometimes between some of the blooming. But I do have one question. Can the trees along the river in, say, the Ohio, or maybe the New River along the East Coast, the wood will show pollutants or signs of the water being contaminated?
Potentially, yeah. I would say that's still sort of a frontier in tree ring chemistry. Trying to understand how much pollutants get taken up, if it's enough to leave a signal behind, if some species take up more pollutants than others, if the dilution in a waterway makes it less so versus soil, all those things. So I think I have like 10 more minutes before Q&A. Is that correct? So let's talk a little bit about applications. I mean, we're essentially like talking about them already. I did want to talk about the last principle because it gets into applications. This is the complicated slide. I'm going to show you a much easier one. This is the last principle of aggregate tree growth. What it's saying is that ring width is a function of the age of a tree. Trees naturally, they don't, like we do, we talked about this already. Trees aren't like people. They don't just get to a certain size and then slow down. It's because as a tree gets bigger, the same amount of wood will make a smaller ring than when the tree's smaller. So it's a sort of a natural sort of decrease in ring width that happens as the tree gets bigger. Age plus climate plus disturbances. D1 and D2 are just disturbances that are unique to a tree and disturbances that are a stand level, a forest level disturbance. And then air. So we do have an air term. There's some part of a ring width that we can explain with a model. It really is like a model, like you're trying to explain the width of a ring with a bunch of different variables. And there's always going to be that little bit that we can't quite explain. But a ring equals all of these things. So I tried to break this down into maybe a simpler visual. So we have a ring, right? It equals age. Is it a really old tree? Is it a really young tree, right? It equals plus. So that's part of the ring width is the age of the tree. The next part is the climate. Was it warm? Was it wet? Or whatever variable that tree prefers, because the disclaimer is that species prefer different things. In general, rain and temperature, warmth are good, but some trees, like the trees I study in the Greater Yellowstone, actually like it a little cold and dry. So the opposite of what you would think. It can be too wet for some tree species. And then some, what we call exogenous or stand level disturbance. A frost event, an insect infestation, a fire affects another portion of the ring. And then some sort of internal disturbance. Maybe lightning struck that tree. Maybe humans interfered. Maybe some of the branches have died back for some reason. But it's unique to that tree. And then I tried to make that the oops. And then there's the air, right? The portion of the ring that we can't explain. This is important too, and it gets to applications because as a tree ring scientist, what I do is I understand all of these things are affecting the growth of a tree. But often I want to understand one of them in more detail. I want to understand how much of the growth is affected by that thing that I'm studying. It could be climate, it could be fire or insects. So I usually am picking one thing out of here that I want to understand. So the important takeaway from this is we're pulling a signal out of a lot of noise. So another thing that we have to do is this. We have to find things that don't exist, and we have to pull signals out of very noisy things. We do it. But again, it's just so much more. So tree ring scientists sort the signal from the noise. In my career, that signal has been fires in the Florida Keys, climate in the Greater Yellowstone, climate in Kentucky, land use change from archaeological timbers, landslide events in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and the urban heat island influence on growth here in the city of Louisville. So those are all the things. Those are the signals that I'm trying to pull from the noise, and those are the applications. Using trees to understand climate, disturbance, fire, insects. The more extreme things that I've been investigating, and my colleagues have, moose herbivory on trees. The nuclear emissions that I talked about earlier, and other contaminants in the environment. I think Those are probably the most obscure. My brain's just stopping on some of the more extreme ones, but they're there. But trees are awesome recorders of change. They sit in one spot for hundreds to thousands of years and just respond to things around them. They're an excellent toolkit then for investigating a lot of different things. As a tree ring scientist, I'm always like, I hear this problem that people want to solve, and I'm like, can tree rings do that? Can I study that with tree rings? I think I can. It's also cool because trees essentially make substance out of air, out of nothing. So they're made from all of the elements around them, from the air, from the water, from the soil. They are made from all of those things. So they are taking in and holding on to those things over time, and they record it for us. And what's nice is it puts on a ring 100 years ago, and that ring just sits there. And we can go back and investigate it. We can understand what happened 100 years ago because it was preserved in that time capsule, in that tree. The main application of tree ring science is to understand climate. These are actually pine trees. These are sort of that bonsai, short, stunted. You can here's me. I'm sitting down, but I'm coring. My colleague's behind the tree. So you can see, like, maybe the tree's 15 feet tall, 15 to 20 feet tall. These trees were 600 years old. You can also see how big around compared to me. There's also scars on this side. There are a lot of lightning scars up here. We are on the top of a rocky ridge in the middle of pretty much desert outside of Cody, Wyoming. Very exposed trees. Everything that came through just struck by lightning a lot. So there was a lot of disturbance, and we found that it did generate noise for us that we had to work around when we were looking at climate. The way we do this is we find out if trees are sensitive to a climate variable that we want to investigate. We do that by looking at the relationship between a ring width and that climate variable. Are they related to each other statistically? If they're not, then those trees aren't good at helping us understand that past climate variable, unfortunately. And sometimes you can do a lot of work and go through all the principles of dendrochronology to pick a site and it not be what you need it to be. But you're a good scientist. You're like, well, okay, got to scrap that. Got to find a better site. It's not going to work, and I'm not going to make it work. So you have to do that first. You have to find those trees that are sensitive, that have a relationship. In this case, we were after precip. And we were ridgetop, rocky soil, in a desert, outside of Cody. These trees should be responsive to precip. The next step is to see if that relationship is maintained through time. The way that we do that is we look at a relationship. We have climate data for 100 years. For most places, it goes back to 1895, 1900, maybe 1920. You take your tree rings and you correlate them against your climate. You do it in little windows of time, and you move it back through time. And you check the relationship each step. Often it's a window, and we move it 1 year at a time, and we check the relationship. What this means is, say in the last 50 years, the tree was responding to moisture, but in the previous 50, it was not. That's a problem because it invalidates the assumption of uniformitarianism. The principle I told you about earlier, that the way trees respond now are the way they always have. If you look at 100 years and that's not even true for 100 years, it violates that assumption. And again, you're like, well, scrap that. So you found ones that were sensitive, but they weren't sensitive for consistently. So not good for a climate reconstruction. You have to find the ones that are sensitive and are sensitive for that whole period. So if what we call the signal, the relationship is strong and it's consistent, we can use it to build a model. So want to just show you some examples, and we'll probably just we'll finish climate, and we'll go to Q&A. An example of this, correlation might even be something. I'm like throwing it out there, but like correlation is how well two patterns match each other. And it's either positive, when one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. That's a positive relationship. Or it's a negative relationship. When one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. Or when one thing goes down, the other thing goes up. For example, if precip goes down and tree growth goes up, or if precip goes up and tree growth goes up, there are different types of relationships. These are just graphs of those relationships from previous May to current October. So this is that lag. We usually look at the previous year too. These trees have positive relationships with summertime precipitation. That's just looking at the relationships. I don't want you to get too much in the weeds here. It's just that there's a positive relationship between tree growth and summertime precip. Makes sense, right? Summertime rain equals more growth in the tree. Makes sense. It's what we would expect to find. And it's positive because both go up together. Precip goes up, tree growth goes up. It's a positive relationship. If precip goes down, tree growth goes down. That's also a positive relationship. They follow each other. We sometimes look at this spatially. This is a map. Here's the greater Yellowstone region. The dark reds are a strong positive relationship. So we can actually look at relationships between our trees and climate over space. And you could see that trees in the greater Yellowstone have a relationship with climate that extends into a broader region. This is actually kind of nice because it means your trees can inform much more in terms of a reconstruction than just your little site. And they inform a much broader region. We look to see if the relationship's stable through time. And we do that with graphs like this. Another complicated one, don't get in the weeds. Blue is a positive relationship. The darker it is, the stronger it is. And the little stars are statistical significance. Don't worry too much about that. Going from 1895 to in this case, 2014. A relationship is stable over that whole 100-year period if it's blue and relatively dark blue all the way across. It's unstable if it fades out, disappears, or if it switches from blue to red. We see that the relationships, these blue bands, like right here, this is previous September temperature. In June and May, September, so fall and early growing season matter a lot here. And they're pretty consistent. What's interesting, so this is an example where I ran the analysis backwards. And what you start to see when you run it this way is the emergence of this negative relationship with previous summer temperature conditions. That's a new relationship that's starting to show up. Now, you can only speculate, like, is that climate change? What's happening here? We can only really know if we maybe look at that pattern over a longer period of time and see if it persists. So you have to make sure with things like that they exist for a longer period of time. Once we skipped ahead, didn't I? So we use that relationship to build a model, understanding that tree growth is a function of climate. We basically reverse that to build a model back through time. We make climate a function of tree growth. We take their relationship, flip it over, and build it backwards through time. So my last question for you regarding this, showing you a climate reconstruction that I did for the greater Yellowstone. So the reds are really warm periods, the cools are cool periods, the blues. What do you notice about the modern years? Yeah, that thing at the end. It spiked up. Yes, there are really warm periods in Yellowstone's past. Wouldn't deny that. But what's happened here? You said it's spiked up. It's not. It far exceeds any of the others in a much shorter period of time. So much of the warming in Yellowstone has occurred in the 2000s, and it's been on a warming trend. You have to think of it sort of as a longer trend. So from here up this way, it's been warming. But then it exceeded at least everything we know about the last 1,200 years and has continued to do so. So so why do we care about past climate? What does it do for us? I kind of gave it away. It provides the context for this. It tells us this is unprecedented. The amount of warming, the timing, how quickly it's happened here in the last 1,000 years. And then we do things like lake sediment cores and ice records and ocean sediment cores to push back even further to understand that what is happening now is unprecedented in the last 800 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 years. Like we know that. And we care because we need to know where we stand. Yeah. Yes. So that's a reconstruction. Yeah, the question's about, does that affect the future growth of the tree? It does. This is white bark pine. White bark pine likes it cool and dry. It already exists in a fairly small range, in the highest elevations of the western, mainly up through Greater Yellowstone into the Canadian Rockies. Climate change is affecting it. Humans are affecting it because they've removed fire. It's actually a species that does like some fire. They've introduced an invasive fungus that is also killing it. So it's one of those species that is unlikely to persist into the future as projected because it's being bombarded from all sides. Yes. Yeah.
And I'm playing ball on the same team. But if you just step back about 5 years, you could say, well, everything was great just a couple years ago. Like that graph, right?
Well, great is relative.
So why is there such a dramatic spike when the environment has been doing this over a very long period of time? In other words, we hit a trigger.
Yeah, what's
Flip the switch.
what's the start? Is that 2000? I can't even read it.
So it's it's 2000.
So if you step back 2 years ago, that's pretty fast.
So what we know about
We have to integrate that into the total.
one element to understand is that global warming has been happening for a much longer time than this. Global warming describes global average temperature, the global average temperature, and it has been going up, and we know that. And it tracks with global CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. The consequences of climate change vary. I should rephrase it. Global warming is the increased average temperature of the Earth. The consequences of global warming vary across space. Some areas, like Kentucky, as you'll see next week, have been in a relatively cooler compared to the last 100 years within that pretty short context. Until recent. So a lot of the warming in Kentucky has been in the 2000s and since. Right? So it varies over space which areas are going to experience the worst of the warming first. For us, for the Earth, it's the Arctic that is experiencing it first and has been experiencing it longer. Some areas, I'm simplifying it by saying some areas may be buffered, but they're experiencing it later. But you also have to think about, this shows how much it's unprecedented in that short period of time, but the warming has been going on since the middle of the century. It's been coming out of that. The other thing to understand is this is long-term. This is sort of moving averages that are going into these values. They're not single years. So that's also something. So it took, part of this is still in the warming trend, but 2000 is the moment when that moving window moved beyond zero into the next regime. Yeah.
Do a statistical test, and that's a trend line. If you just did a regression analysis and average the red and blue, is that trend line going up? And if it is, that's 720. I can't read it, but if you went back beyond 700 BC, would you see a line that went like this? In other words, ice ages. In other words, it's been trending up over 2,000 years, but if you went back 10,000 years, would it go up and down and up and down?
So yes, so it would. We're getting so what you look for as evidence that climate change is real, it's happening, we're causing it. We provide these long-term context. So actually, if you look back over the last million years, you see the ups and downs. You see glacials, interglacials, okay? And it goes up and down. But it has this sort of natural range of variability. Everything varies over time, but it has this natural range that it doesn't exceed. And then you see, middle of 1900s, we pass the threshold of normal variability. We exceed the max that it's ever been for the last million years. And then it goes up. But it doesn't just go up to where it's been up in the past. Of course, I need like a whiteboard. It's doing this. So this is the range of normal variability. Here's the top, okay? So yes, it gets warm and it gets cold. But then it exceeds that range, and then it keeps going. And in a really short period of time. It's kind of like this. You see the range of variability, the warmest and coolest it's gotten, and then you see that it exceeds that, and it keeps going. It's things like this too. Like I had this in here for a reason, because you don't use 1 year as evidence for climate change. You don't use one event as evidence for climate change. You know, deniers will use a blizzard as evidence that it's not real. Right? Blizzard is just weather. If you want to argue to show people that climate change is happening, you also don't want to just pick on one hot year as your evidence, because you're falling in the same trap. We look for trends in the data. Trends that are continuing, trends is anything up or down, and also trends that move outside that range of normal variability. For example, the top 10 hottest years have been in the top years. Like each year is a new hottest year in the top 10 years. And it's projected that it's only going to continue. That's a trend. So you're not just using 1 year. You're like, look at the trend. It's predicted the next 10 years are going to do that too. And so I had to find this one to show you how 2022 fell in that range as well. So we're getting in the weeds of it, but it is a big part of what I do. Like I study climate change, and I do it by studying trees, and it's an important thing that we need to understand. Yes?
I'm a little older, and I have seen differences in glaciers. Where I went up in Canada and see the glaciers, they moved back further from where the tourists were gathering,
Mm-hmm.
and that much heat. Of course, that's a sizable amount of melting of water, and I'm pretty sure that's probably going on the other pole also.
Yeah, so we see alpine glaciers melting. Global sea ice extent is less and less each year. So it's the trends. This has been one of the worst. I think it is the worst for Arctic sea ice extent recorded. And it's just been part of this decreasing trend through time. So there are multiple lines of evidence to support that. And these are things that are actually recorded. Even within the last 100 years, we see enough change But then tree rings and other proxies help us understand beyond that to see just how unprecedented it is. I think we are out of time. I'm happy to linger if people have individual questions. We'll continue on this vein. Maybe not happy to talk about climate change as much as you'd like, but talking about tree rings applications and including some applications here in Kentucky, so close to home. You can see some sort of things that are happening here. Next class. I hope to see you there. Thank you, everybody.